After quitting his 30-year job, a lonely man moved to a remote cabin in the woods, hoping to escape the exhaustion that had consumed his life for decades. But hidden beneath that old cabin in the woods was a mysterious underground secret no one was supposed to find. What he discovered below the frozen earth would change his life forever and bring lost people to his door one by one. Subscribe for more emotional stories and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Ethan Brooks used to wake up before sunrise every single morning. Not because he wanted to, because his body no longer knew how to rest. At 58 years old, Ethan had spent more than 3 decades working as an operations director for a shipping company in Seattle. 30 years of conference calls, 30 years of fluorescent lights humming above his head while rain streaked across office windows. 30 years of solving problems that were forgotten the moment another email arrived. People called him dependable, efficient, successful, but somewhere along the way, his life had become something mechanical, a routine so polished it no longer felt human. After his wife passed away 7 years earlier, the silence inside his house had become unbearable. So Ethan buried himself deeper into work, convincing himself productivity was the same thing as purpose, until the morning his chest tightened during a staff meeting. Not enough for an ambulance, just enough to scare him. 3 weeks later, he resigned quietly. No celebration, no farewell dinner. He packed old notebooks into a cardboard box, handed over his office badge, and walked into the cold November air feeling strangely invisible. Then came the letter. A cabin in northern Montana had been left to him by Arthur Bennett, a distant uncle his family rarely mentioned. They used to call Arthur strange, said he disappeared into the woods years ago and never really came back. Inside the envelope was a rusted key, and a single sentence written in uneven handwriting. "When the noise becomes too heavy, come listen to the earth." A week later, Ethan found himself driving through endless pine forests beneath a gray winter sky. The road narrowed into gravel, then nearly vanished altogether. By the time he saw the cabin standing alone among the trees, snow had already begun falling softly around it. The place looked weathered, forgotten by time, but not abandoned. As Ethan stepped onto the porch, a strange feeling settled deep in his chest. Not fear, recognition, as if some hidden part of him had been waiting for this place long before he ever arrived. And beneath the cabin, something was already waiting for him too. The first night in the cabin, Ethan Brooks barely slept. Not because of the cold, and not because of the forest. It was the silence, real silence. The kind that doesn't simply surround you, it enters you, slowly, patiently, until every thought you've spent years outrunning finally catches up. Back in Seattle, there had always been noise. Traffic outside the condo, elevator doors opening and closing, phones buzzing at midnight, the endless hum of a world terrified of stillness. But here, there was nothing. No sirens, no television, no glowing notifications demanding pieces of his attention. Only the soft groan of timber settling in the dark, and the whisper of wind moving through the pine trees beyond the walls. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar smoke and old paper. A cast-iron stove sat near the center of the room, blackened by decades of use. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty books, glass jars, and hand tools so carefully arranged they almost looked ceremonial. Arthur Bennett had not lived carelessly. Everything here had intention. Ethan sat on the edge of the narrow bed long after midnight, elbows on his knees, staring into the weak orange glow of the fire. For years, he had believed exhaustion was normal. Necessary, even if you weren't overwhelmed, you weren't important. If you slowed down, you fell behind. That was the rhythm of the world he came from. But sitting there in the quiet heart of the woods, that rhythm suddenly felt unnatural, artificial, like a machine spinning faster and faster until no one remembered why it started moving in the first place. He finally drifted asleep sometime before dawn. When he woke, pale winter light spilled through the frosted windows. The cabin felt warm, warmer than it should have. Ethan frowned. The fire had burned out hours ago, outside. Snow covered the ground in a smooth, untouched blanket, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing overnight. Yet somehow, the cold never fully entered the cabin. The floor beneath his feet held a strange, steady warmth, subtle, balanced, almost alive. Curiosity stirred inside him. It surprised him how unfamiliar that feeling had become. For most of his adult life, curiosity had been replaced by efficiency. Questions were inconveniences. Wonder was unproductive. But this place awakened something old in him, something buried. He spent the morning exploring the cabin more carefully. Near the back wall, behind a tall bookshelf filled with weathered journals, he noticed something strange. The wood paneling sounded hollow when he knocked against it. Not empty, exactly structured. Deliberate! He pressed his palm against the wall. Cold air moved faintly beneath the surface. His pulse quickened. After several minutes of searching, Ethan discovered a narrow latch hidden behind one of the shelves. It clicked softly beneath his fingers, and part of the wall shifted open by only a few inches. Behind it was a narrow passageway. The air drifting upward felt dry and clean, carrying the scent of stone and earth. Ethan hesitated. A part of him wanted to close the panel and walk away. But another part, the part that had driven across 3 states chasing something he couldn't explain, stepped forward instead. The passage led downward. At the end of it, partially concealed beneath the cabin itself, was a heavy wooden trapdoor, reinforced with iron hinges worn smooth from years of use. His heart pounded as he pulled it open. Darkness waited below. He grabbed an old flashlight hanging near the stairs and began descending carefully, one step at a time. The temperature changed immediately. Cool. Stable. Controlled. And when the beam of light finally swept across the underground space beneath the cabin, Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. It wasn't a cellar. It was an entire system. Stone chambers reinforced with timber beams, ventilation shafts carved into the earth at precise angles, shelves stacked with preserved vegetables, sealed jars, dried herbs, handwritten labels dated years back. Nothing down there looked improvised. Every inch had been designed with patience, with understanding. In the center of the room sat a long wooden work table, and resting on top of it was a thick, leather-bound journal. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside were pages upon pages of notes written in Arthur's steady handwriting. Airflow cycles, moisture behavior, soil temperature patterns, observations about stillness, about preservation, about how the earth itself could protect what people were too distracted to value anymore. Then Ethan found a single sentence underlined near the bottom of one page. The world teaches people to consume. Nature teaches them to sustain. Something inside him cracked open. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. For 30 years, Ethan had lived a life built entirely around speed, deadlines, growth charts, constant motion. But down here, beneath the cabin, none of those things mattered. Everything survived because it moved slowly, steadily, patiently. Ethan lowered himself into the chair beside the table, staring at Arthur's journal while tears gathered silently in his eyes. He hadn't cried when his wife died. He hadn't cried when he left his job. But here, deep beneath the frozen earth, surrounded by a silence that somehow felt alive, he finally understood how tired he truly was. And for the first time in decades, he no longer wanted to run. The days after discovering the underground chamber began to blur together in a way Ethan Brooks had never experienced before. Not because they were forgettable, but because they finally felt real. He woke with the sunrise now, not to alarms or calendar reminders, but to pale winter light slipping quietly through the cabin windows. Each morning, he lit the stove, boiled water from the nearby creek, and carried Arthur's leather journal to the kitchen table like it was something sacred. In many ways, it was. The deeper Ethan read, the more he realized the underground system wasn't merely built for storage. It was built around a philosophy. Arthur believed modern life disconnected people from rhythm, from seasons, patience, and the quiet intelligence of the natural world. The cellar beneath the cabin wasn't designed to fight nature. It cooperated with it. And somehow that idea haunted Ethan. At night, he found himself sitting underground long after the lantern burned low, listening to the soft movement of air through the stone vents. The silence there felt different. Not empty, protective, like the earth itself was breathing slowly around him. On the 7th morning, snow fell heavily across the forest. Ethan pulled on his coat and stepped outside to gather firewood before the storm worsened. The cold bit sharply against his face as he crossed the clearing beside the cabin. That was when he saw them. Footprints. Fresh. His body stiffened immediately. Oh. They emerged from the tree line at the edge of the woods and crossed straight through the snow toward the back of the property. Human footprints. Boots. Small ones. Ethan scanned the forest instinctively. Nothing moved. No voices. No wind. Just the endless white stillness between the trees. His pulse quickened as he followed the tracks carefully. They led toward the old shed behind the cabin, a weather-beaten structure leaning slightly to one side beneath the weight of snow. Ethan had noticed it before, but never opened it. The door had been chained loosely shut, as though someone wanted privacy more than security. The footprints stopped there. No return trail. Ethan stared at the shed for several long seconds. Then he heard it. A faint sound from inside. Movement. Slow. Careful. He swallowed hard and approached the door. "Hello?" he called out. No answer. Only silence again. Ethan hesitated before unhooking the rusted chain. The metal clinked loudly in the stillness. Then he pulled the door open slowly. The smell hit him first. Smoke, wool, and something human beneath it. The shed was dim except for the weak orange flicker of a tiny wood stove burning in the corner. Blankets were piled against the wall beside it. And beneath them, someone moved! Ethan froze. A girl slowly lifted her head from the blankets. 14. Maybe 15 years old. Thin, pale from the cold. Dark hair tangled around her face. Her frightened eyes locked onto his instantly, wide with the kind of fear that comes from surviving too much for too long. Neither of them spoke at first. The girl looked ready to bolt. Ethan slowly raised both hands. "Hey," he said gently. "It's okay." Her breathing stayed shallow and uneven. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The words felt fragile in the frozen air. The girl stared at him for several more seconds before whispering. "You live here now?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Just recently." At that, something shifted in her expression. Not trust. Recognition. Her eyes drifted briefly towards the cabin behind him. Then she asked quietly, "What happened to Arthur?" The question landed heavily in Ethan's chest. "He passed away," Ethan answered softly. "Almost 2 years ago." The girl looked down immediately. A strange silence filled the shed. Not awkward. Grieving. Ethan crouched slightly to soften his posture. "You knew him." She nodded once. "He helped me before." Her voice cracked near the end of the sentence, like even speaking about it hurt. Ethan studied her carefully now. The oversized coat. The worn boots. The exhaustion in her face. This wasn't a runaway adventure. This was survival. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. The girl hesitated for a long moment. "Ellie?" Ethan gave a small nod. "I'm Ethan." Another silence stretched between them. Then Ethan glanced toward the weak fire struggling inside the tiny stove. "You shouldn't stay out here tonight," he said gently. "The temperature's dropping fast." Ellie immediately tensed again. "I'm fine." The automatic response of someone who had learned never to depend on anyone. Ethan recognized it instantly, because he had spent years doing the exact same thing. He slowly removed his gloves and placed them on an old crate near the doorway. Then he stepped back. "There's food inside," he said quietly. "Warm coffee, too." Ellie said nothing. Ethan nodded once toward the cabin. "You don't have to decide right now." And with that, he turned and walked back through the snow without looking behind him. That night, he left the cabin door unlocked. He placed an extra bowl of stew near the stove, an extra blanket beside the fire. And though he told himself not to expect anything, sometime after midnight he heard it, the soft creak of the cabin door opening. Ethan looked up slowly from Arthur's journal. Ellie stood frozen near the entrance, snow melting from her boots onto the wooden floor. Her face remained guarded, exhausted, uncertain. Like someone standing at the edge of a life they weren't sure they deserved to enter. Ethan didn't speak. He simply pulled out the empty chair across from him. And after a long hesitation, Ellie stepped forward and sat down. The silence that followed felt sacred, as if the cabin itself had been waiting for her too. The cabin changed after Ellie arrived. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, almost invisible ways that Ethan Brooks began noticing more each day. There were now 2 mugs drying beside the sink instead of 1, 2 pairs of boots near the stove, 2 shadows moving quietly through the firelight at night. And somehow, those tiny changes made the cabin feel less like a place someone had escaped to, and more like a place someone could belong to. Ellie barely spoke during her first few days inside. She moved carefully, like she was afraid taking up too much space might cause everything around her to disappear. She ate slowly, slept lightly. And every time Ethan entered a room unexpectedly, her shoulders tightened instinctively before relaxing again. Fear lived deep inside her, the kind that doesn't leave quickly. Ethan understood that more than she realized. He didn't push her with questions. Didn't ask where she came from. Didn't ask what she was running from. Instead, they settled into a rhythm. In the mornings, Ethan made coffee while Ellie sat near the stove, wrapped in one of Arthur's old wool blankets, watching snow drift across the windows. Sometimes she helped carry wood inside. Sometimes she organized jars in the kitchen without being asked. Quiet tasks, steady tasks, the kind that asked nothing from a person except presence. And slowly, something inside the cabin softened. One afternoon, Ethan found Ellie standing near the hidden entrance behind the bookshelf. She looked back at him carefully. "What's down there?" she asked. Ethan paused. Then, for reasons he didn't fully understand himself, he answered honestly. "Something important." Ellie studied him for a second before asking, "Can I see it?" For a brief moment, Ethan hesitated. The underground chamber had already become sacred to him somehow. Private, almost protective. Bringing someone else into that space felt strangely vulnerable. But then he remembered something Arthur had written in the journal. A shelter only matters if someone else can enter it. So Ethan moved the bookshelf aside. Together, they descended the narrow staircase beneath the cabin. Ellie's breathing slowed the moment they reached the bottom. The underground room glowed softly beneath the lantern light. Stone walls, wooden shelves, rows of preserved food carefully arranged beside Arthur's handwritten diagrams and notes. Ellie turned slowly in place, her eyes wide with quiet amazement. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ethan almost smiled. Beautiful wasn't the word most people would have used for a root cellar buried beneath frozen earth. But she was right. It was beautiful. Ellie walked carefully between the shelves, running her fingertips lightly across the glass jars. "How does it stay warm?" she asked softly. "It doesn't," Ethan replied. "That's the point." She frowned slightly. He stepped beside one of the ventilation shafts Arthur had carved deep into the stone. "The earth keeps everything balanced," he explained. "Not too cold, not too warm, just steady." Ellie looked around again, quieter this time. "Arthur showed me this place once," she admitted suddenly. Ethan turned toward her. "You've been here before?" She nodded faintly, a long time ago. Her voice drifted almost into the walls themselves. He said the world makes people feel disposable. But places like this... She swallowed hard. Places like this remind people they matter. The words hit Ethan harder than he expected, because for most of his life, he had only understood value through usefulness. How many hours he worked, how much money he earned, how productive he could be before collapsing from exhaustion. Even grief had been something he tried to outwork. But down here, none of those things existed. The jars weren't valuable because they were profitable. The cellar worked because it preserved, because it protected, because it made things last. And maybe people weren't so different. That night, snowstorm winds howled through the forest while Ethan and Ellie sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, lit only by candlelight and fire. The cabin felt warmer now, alive in a way Ethan hadn't realized he missed. Ellie stared quietly into her tea before speaking. "I used to think people only kept you around if you were useful." Ethan looked at her carefully. "Yeah," he said softly. "Me too." The honesty in his own voice surprised him. For years, Ethan had built his identity around being needed professionally, reliable, efficient, replaceable only because he worked hard enough to delay it. But sitting here now, listening to the fire crackle while snow buried the world outside, he realized something painful. No one had ever taught him how to simply exist without earning his place first. Arthur had understood that. Ellie somehow understood it too. And slowly, Ethan was beginning to learn it himself. Later that evening, Ellie stood quietly near the underground entrance before bed. She glanced back at Ethan. "Do you think Arthur built all this because he wanted to hide from people?" Ethan looked toward the hidden staircase. Then he shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I think he built it because he wanted people to find their way back." Ellie didn't answer. But for the first time since arriving at the cabin, she smiled, just a little, and somehow, that small, fragile smile changed something inside Ethan more than 30 years in the corporate world ever had. Winter began loosening its grip on the forest. Not suddenly, but little by little, the way healing often happens. The snow around the cabin softened during the afternoons now, dripping steadily from the pine branches outside. The creek behind the property had started moving again beneath thin sheets of melting ice, carrying the sound of flowing water through the trees like a quiet promise. And somehow, without Ethan Brooks realizing exactly when it happened, the cabin no longer felt isolated. It felt alive. Ellie changed first. At least, that's what Ethan noticed. She began waking before him some mornings, already feeding wood into the stove when he came downstairs. The fear in her eyes hadn't disappeared entirely, but it no longer controlled every movement she made. Now she asked questions, real questions. How do the vents keep moisture from building up? Why are the root vegetables stored lower than the preserves? What happens if the airflow changes during spring? And every time Ethan answered, he realized something strange. He cared again. Not about quarterly reports or deadlines or numbers on spreadsheets, but about teaching, about sharing something meaningful. One afternoon, they were reorganizing the underground shelves together when Ethan noticed Ellie adjusting several of the stone airflow markers Arthur had placed near the lower wall. He frowned slightly. "Why'd you move those?" Ellie glanced up nervously at first, then pointed toward the vent shaft above them. "The air curves differently now," she explained quietly. "Since the snow's melting, the humidity changed. I think it'll circulate better this way." Ethan studied the room for a moment, then slowly nodded. She was right. A small smile spread across Ellie's face, cautious, but proud. And in that moment, Ethan realized this place was becoming something more than Arthur's old system. It was evolving, living, not because of him alone, but because someone else had begun caring for it too. That realization settled deep inside his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't simply maintaining a life. He was building one. Then the outside world arrived. It happened 3 days later. Ethan was repairing the cabin steps when he heard the distant crunch of tires against wet gravel. A dusty blue pickup truck emerged slowly through the trees and stopped near the edge of the clearing. An older woman stepped out, late 60s, heavy coat, gloves worn thin from years of work. Her gray hair was tucked beneath a knitted hat, and she carried a wooden crate carefully in both hands. Ethan stood slowly as she approached. "You Ethan?" she asked. He nodded cautiously. The woman glanced briefly toward the cabin before speaking again. "My name's Margaret," she said. "Arthur helped my husband years ago." Something about the way she said Arthur's name carried deep respect. Not nostalgia, gratitude. Ethan stepped closer. How did he help? Margaret lowered her eyes toward the crate in her hands. "Our crops kept failing one winter. Potatoes rotted early, lost near half our storage." She paused. "Arthur showed us how to preserve them underground properly. Saved us." Truth be told, Ethan felt a strange tightness in his throat. Another piece of Arthur's life quietly revealing itself. Not a hermit, not a recluse, a guardian. Margaret carefully lifted the lid off the crate. Inside were jars of homemade jam wrapped tightly in cloth. "I heard someone was living here again," she said softly. Thought maybe the cellar still worked. Ethan looked toward the cabin behind him, toward the hidden underground room beneath it, toward the strange, quiet purpose that had slowly transformed him over the past weeks. Then he looked back at Margaret. "It does," he answered. Something relieved passed across her face. That afternoon, Ethan and Ellie carried the jars downstairs together. Ellie handled each one carefully, placing them onto the shelves beside Arthur's old preserves. The room seemed fuller suddenly, warmer somehow. Not because of the food, because of trust. The next morning, another visitor arrived. Then another. A beekeeper from a neighboring town brought honey sealed in glass jars, asking if the underground temperature might help it last longer. A widowed farmer delivered onions wrapped in newspaper. A young couple brought seeds they were afraid would die before spring planting. Word had spread quietly through the mountains. About the cabin. About the cellar. About the man who had come from the city and reopened Arthur Bennett's hidden sanctuary beneath the woods. But Ethan began realizing something important. People weren't only bringing food. They were bringing exhaustion, loneliness, grief, fear, and somehow the cabin held space for all of it. One evening, after the last visitor had left, Ethan stood alone beneath the underground lantern light, staring at the shelves slowly filling with jars. Roots, herbs, and handwritten labels. Ellie stepped beside him quietly. "It's different now," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Yeah," he whispered. The cellar no longer felt like a secret buried beneath the earth. It felt like the beginning of something. Not a business. Not a movement. Something quieter. Something human. A place where people could bring the fragile parts of themselves without shame. A place where nothing and no one needed to be rushed to survive. And standing there beneath the cabin, surrounded by the slow, steady breath of the earth itself, Ethan realized Arthur hadn't left him an inheritance. He had left him a responsibility. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains. The snow retreated deeper into the woods, exposing patches of dark earth beneath the trees. The creek behind the cabin ran louder now, swollen with melted ice. And birds Ethan Brooks couldn't name returned each morning like tiny reminders that life always found its way back. But the biggest change wasn't happening outside. It was happening inside him. The man who once measured his worth in productivity reports and 12-hour workdays had begun disappearing quietly, piece by piece. And in his place, someone steadier was emerging, each morning before sunrise. Ethan climbed down into the underground chamber with Arthur's journal tucked beneath his arm. He moved through the space slowly now, instinctively checking airflow channels, moisture levels, and storage shelves with the calm confidence of someone finally learning how to belong somewhere. The cellar no longer felt mysterious. It felt alive. And somehow, it was teaching him. Ellie noticed it too. "You smile more now," she said one evening while sealing jars beside the work table. Ethan looked up, surprised. "Do I?" She nodded once. "You didn't before." The truth hit him harder than he expected. For years, he had lived in survival mode without realizing it, existing, producing, enduring, but never actually living. Now, somehow, peace had begun replacing pressure. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough for him to feel the difference. Then came the storm. It started just after midnight. Not snow this time, rain. Heavy spring rain crashing violently against the roof, while thunder rolled through the mountains hard enough to shake the cabin windows. Ethan woke instantly. Something felt wrong. He grabbed the lantern and moved downstairs barefoot, just as another crack of thunder split through the sky. The cabin groaned softly around him beneath the weight of the storm. Then he heard it. A sound from below. Water. His stomach dropped. He rushed towards the hidden staircase and descended into the underground chamber 2 steps at a time. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then he saw it. A thin stream of muddy water slipping through the lower stone wall near the north vent. Ellie appeared behind him seconds later, eyes wide. "Ethan!" The leak was small now, but growing fast. Another hour of rain, and the entire balance of the cellar could collapse. Moisture would destroy the preservation system Arthur spent decades building. Rot would spread through the shelves within weeks. The mountain itself was beginning to shift. Ethan's pulse hammered in his chest. For a brief, terrifying moment, the old version of himself returned, the man who panicked under pressure, who believed every problem demanded immediate control. But then he remembered something Arthur once wrote. "The earth resists force. Listen first." Ethan forced himself to breathe. Think. Observe. He grabbed the lantern and studied the wall carefully. The leak wasn't random. Water pressure from the storm had redirected through one of the upper runoff channels outside the cabin. The system wasn't failing. It was overwhelmed. Ellie stepped closer. "What do we do?" Ethan looked at her, and for the first time, he realized she wasn't asking out of fear anymore. She was asking because this place mattered to her too. "We protect the airflow first," he said calmly. For the next 2 hours, they worked together beneath the storm. Mud soaked through Ethan's boots as he dug runoff trenches outside the cabin in freezing rain. Ellie reinforced lower storage shelves with wooden braces while carefully relocating vulnerable crates deeper into the chamber. The storm raged harder around them. Lightning cracked across the sky. Water continued slipping through the stone wall in narrow streams. Then, just before dawn, a loud cracking sound echoed through the forest. Both of them froze. It came from uphill behind the cabin. Ethan grabbed the lantern and rushed outside through the rain. His heart nearly stopped. A massive pine tree had collapsed during the storm, crashing directly across the upper hillside, where Arthur's hidden ventilation shafts ran beneath the earth. If the roots had crushed the channels, the entire underground system could suffocate. Ellie appeared beside him, breathless. For one long, horrifying second, Ethan imagined everything disappearing. Arthur's work, the cellar, the trust people had begun placing in this place, gone overnight. Then Ellie suddenly pointed toward the ground. Look. Steam rose faintly through the rain near the fallen tree. Ethan stared. The vents were still breathing. Barely, but alive. Relief hit him so hard his knees nearly buckled. Together, soaked by rain and shaking from exhaustion, they spent the entire morning clearing debris away from the damaged hillside. And that was when Ethan found it. Buried beneath exposed roots and wet earth, another hidden hatch. Smaller than the cellar entrance, older. He stared at it silently while rainwater dripped from his jacket sleeves. Ellie stepped closer. Was that always there? Ethan slowly shook his head. No. Arthur had hidden something else beneath the mountain. And judging by the rusted lock and the strange symbol carved into the wood, it was something he never intended anyone to find easily. Ethan placed his hand against the hatch. Cold. Solid. Waiting. Then he noticed something carved faintly beneath the mud-covered handle. 3 words. Only when ready. The storm had passed. But something far bigger had just begun. The rain finally stopped sometime after noon. Fog drifted through the trees in long silver ribbons, while water dripped steadily from the cabin roof. The forest felt strangely quiet after the violence of the storm, as if the mountain itself were exhausted. Ethan Brooks stood beside the hidden hatch buried in the hillside, mud soaking through his gloves, his heartbeat still uneven from everything that had happened. Ellie remained beside him, staring silently at the weathered wooden door half hidden beneath roots and stone. "Are you going to open it?" she asked softly. Ethan didn't answer right away. Part of him wanted to. Another part feared what he might find. Because over the past few months, Arthur Bennett had become more than a distant relative. More than an old man who disappeared into the woods. Arthur had become a mirror. A reminder that another way of living had always existed beneath the noise of the modern world. And now, standing here after nearly losing everything to the storm, Ethan suddenly understood something unsettling. Arthur hadn't built the cellar simply to preserve food. He had been preserving something else. Something fragile. Something human. Ethan slowly wiped mud away from the carved words on the hatch again. Only when ready. Then, finally, he reached for the rusted handle. The lock broke easier than expected, almost as if time itself had already decided this moment would come. The hatch opened with a long groan of old wood and damp iron. Cold air drifted upward from the darkness below. But unlike the cellar beneath the cabin, this space felt different. Older. Deeper. Ethan grabbed the lantern, and together, he and Ellie descended carefully into the narrow chamber beneath the hill. Stone walls surrounded them immediately, rougher than the cellar's carefully built structure. The air smelled faintly of cedar and earth, and something else. Paper. At the bottom, the tunnel widened into a small underground room, and Ethan stopped breathing. Hundreds of notebooks lined the walls. Not storage journals. Personal journals. Dozens upon dozens of them, stacked carefully on wooden shelves preserved perfectly in the cool, dry air. Ellie stepped forward slowly, eyes wide. "Oh my God!" Ethan reached for one, carefully. The leather cracked softly beneath his fingers as he opened it. Inside were names. Dates. Stories. Page after page written in Arthur's quiet handwriting. People he had helped. A widower who nearly drank himself to death after losing his son. A runaway teenager who arrived starving during winter. A veteran who hadn't spoken to anyone for 8 months before sitting beside Arthur's fire one night. And there, halfway through one journal, Ethan found Ellie's name. He looked up at her slowly. She had gone pale, Arthur had written about the first day she arrived years ago, frightened, silent, half frozen beneath a snowstorm, much like the one they had just survived. She thinks being unwanted means being unworthy. Arthur had written, "She is wrong." Ellie's lips trembled violently as Ethan read the words aloud. Then Ethan noticed something else. One final notebook sitting alone on the center table. Newer than the others. Waiting. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. The first page contained only one sentence. "If you're reading this, it means the mountain finally trusted you." Ethan's chest tightened. He turned the page slowly. The entries that followed weren't instructions. They were reflections. Arthur wrote about loneliness, about modern life, about how people had become so overwhelmed by noise and speed that they no longer knew how to sit with themselves anymore. Then Ethan found the final entry. The handwriting was weaker there, slower, but still steady. The cellar was never the legacy. The real work was reminding people they still had value after the world convinced them otherwise. Food rots when neglected. So do people. Silence filled the underground chamber. Heavy. Sacred. Ellie wiped tears from her face quietly, but Ethan barely noticed. Because something inside him had completely broken open. All his life, he thought success meant climbing higher, working harder, becoming more useful. But Arthur understood something deeper. People don't survive because they're productive. They survive because someone finally makes them feel seen. Ethan closed the notebook slowly, tears blurring his vision. For the first time since his wife died, for the first time in decades, he no longer felt hollow. Above them, wind moved softly through the trees. The storm was over. And somehow, so was the life Ethan had spent running from himself. Months later, summer finally arrived in the mountains. The cabin changed again. More people came now. Not crowds, just quiet souls carrying invisible exhaustion. A grieving father, a burned-out teacher, a teenager too anxious to sleep at night, and Ethan welcomed every single one of them. Not because he had answers, but because he had learned how to listen. One evening, as golden sunlight poured through the trees outside, Ellie sat beside him on the porch, watching smoke curl upward from the chimney. "You think Arthur knew all this would happen?" she asked quietly. Ethan smiled softly, then looked toward the forest stretching endlessly beyond the cabin. "No," he said. "I think he just believed lost people eventually find each other." And as the wind moved gently through the pines, carrying the quiet rhythm of the mountain all around them, Ethan realized something beautiful. He hadn't escaped his old life. He had finally found the one he was meant to live. Ethan Brooks believed leaving his 30-year career meant losing everything. But deep in the mountains, inside a quiet cabin and an underground sanctuary built by Arthur Bennett, he discovered something unexpected. Life was never meant to be lived at full speed. The cellar beneath the cabin wasn't just preserving food. It was preserving people. Their peace, their grief, their hope. Through Ellie and the strangers who slowly found their way there, Ethan learned that worth is not measured by productivity, money, or success. Sometimes, the most important thing a person can do is slow down long enough to truly listen to themselves and to others. Because healing doesn't happen in noise. It happens in stillness. And in the end, Ethan realized he hadn't escaped his old life. He had finally found the life he was supposed to live. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more emotional and inspiring stories. And if you know someone feeling lost, exhausted, or overwhelmed by life, share this video with them. Sometimes, one quiet place can change everything.